Dazed German prisoners began to be brought in amidst French civilians welcoming their liberators. Allied air power was overwhelming, and very few German aircraft took to the skies over Normandy on D-Day, the 6th of June. Indeed, the pre-invasion air offensive reduced the available German air protection of Normandy to just 100 fighters. They recorded just 319 sorties on D-Day, as compared to over 14,500 Allied sorties. The weight of bombs, combined with the naval bombardment, served to numb many defenders. The result was that by the evening of D-Day, the Allies were well ashore, with over 150,000 men landed. The British were on Sword and Gold Beaches, the Canadians on Juno, and the Americans on Omaha and Utah. Only Omaha, which was dominated by steep cliffs, presented a real problem, with the attackers pinned down for much of the day on the beach. Hitler had eventually released the Panzer reserves in the afternoon. Their move forward was fraught with difficulty. Blown bridges meant extensive detours. The panzers were constantly harassed by air attack. The result was that the German armour was unable to mount a quick counterattack, and this enabled the Allies to secure and link up their beachheads. But they were prevented from achieving a quick breakout. The German resistance inland quickly stiffened as they recovered from the initial shock of the landings. Tough Waffen-SS troops began to join in the fighting. Much of the Normandy terrain was bocage, the French term for mixed pasture and woodland. In practice, it meant small fields with high, hedge-topped banks, ideal for defensive fighting. Combat-hardened German paratroops used the bocage to good effect. All along the Allied front, the going was equally tough. Allied air power remained supreme in the skies above Normandy, but it did not deter the Germans. This was even though Allied aircraft constantly harried German troops. Slowly, in the face of a sometimes almost fanatical defense, the Allies inched forward. But in spite of the intense pressure, German cohesion did not noticeably weaken. Stormy weather 2 weeks after D-Day did not help matters. The Mulberry harbours, which had been functioning well, were seriously damaged, delaying the Allied build-up. Not until towards the end of June were the Americans able to break into Cherbourg and force its garrison to surrender. But it would be several weeks before the port was back in working use. Caen, originally a British D-Day objective, took 6 weeks bitter fighting to capture in the face of a fanatical defense by men of the Waffen-SS Hitler Youth Division. Yet the Germans were growing ever more desperate. In spite of pleas by von Rundstedt and Rommel, Hitler refused to countenance any voluntary surrender of ground. The constant combat was exhausting the German troops, and their casualties were mounting. On Hitler's orders, von Rundstedt had been replaced by Gunther von Kluge in early July. But on the 20th of the month, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, a staff officer, placed a briefcase bomb timed to go off during a Hitler conference at his headquarters in East Prussia. It detonated, and plotters in Berlin proclaimed Hitler's death. In Paris, SS, Gestapo, and other Nazi officials were arrested. But Hitler survived the bomb blast and was fit enough to meet Mussolini that afternoon. The plotters were quickly arrested. Distinguished soldiers and other public figures were arraigned before a court presided over by the notorious Nazi judge Roland Freisler. Many were hanged. One who escaped this fate was Rommel, wounded 3 days before the bomb blast, but implicated in the plot. He was, though, forced to commit suicide to protect his family. Back in Normandy, by the last week in July, Montgomery had succeeded in drawing the bulk of the German armour onto the British in the east. This enabled the Americans to begin the breakout from the west. It was spearheaded by George S. Patton's U.S. Third Army. Patton himself was a cavalryman who had commanded tanks in France in 1918. He well understood the potential for armour to exploit a breakout. His tank spearheads were soon thrusting into Brittany and eastwards into the heart of France. The final act in Normandy was played out in mid-August, around Falaise. The Allies tried to trap the remaining German forces there. Some managed to escape eastwards. The remainder were pulverized from the air. The resultant carnage was a stark illustration of how air power could influence the ground battle. Now, as the shattered German remnants withdrew eastwards, the Allies began a lightning advance. Town after town was liberated, to the joy of their inhabitants. The climax came on the 25th of August, when French, Polish, and American troops entered Paris. But this was amid fighting, as the hard core of the German garrison fought it out with members of the French Army of the Interior, who had risen against their occupiers as the Allies approached the capital. To this day, if you walk the streets of Paris, you will see small memorials to those French people killed in the fighting at the spot where they fell. It was ironical that while these street battles were being fought, across the other side of Europe, the Polish Home Army was also fighting the Germans in their capital, Warsaw.